The Great Depression is usually taught as a tragic malfunction of capitalism, a freak break in the gears that no one foresaw and no one could stop. Textbooks circle endlessly around October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, as if the crash burst from nowhere, a meteor from a clear sky. But if you look beneath that surface, another reading emerges. The crisis was not only the outcome of bad luck and mistaken bets. It was also a moment that advantaged, and in certain respects was shaped by, the very financial elites best positioned to profit from disorder. The catastrophe that delivered hunger, unemployment, and humiliation to millions became, for a smaller circle, an opening to consolidate assets cheaply and tighten their grip on the architecture of the global economy. To see how that dynamic could unfold, widen the frame beyond a single volatile week, and trace the decades of engineering that primed the system. The seeds were planted in the age of gilded consolidation, when trusts fused market power with political reach and corporate finance learned to steer legislation. Out of that era came the Federal Reserve in 1913, promoted as a stabilizer that would prevent panics and smooth cycles. In practice, the new central bank centralized extraordinary authority over money and credit in a small committee tied tightly to the largest banks. The public case emphasized safety. The institutional effect was to give those nearest to the credit spigot leverage over everyone else. During the Roaring '20s, the script looked almost textbook. The Fed kept rates low and credit abundant. Wall Street's promotion engines extolled a new era in which science and productivity had tamed risk. Brokers extended margin loans liberally. Department clerks and machinists bought shares with borrowed dollars. Magazines praised leverage as a democratic pathway to wealth. Speculation rose on speculation, prices pushed up by credit that was justified by yesterday's price rise. Yet even as the public bought the dream, the insiders were preparing for a turn. By 1928, the central bank began tightening, and major houses quietly lightened positions, while celebrating prosperity in their newsletters. When prices buckled in October 1929, the damage cascaded through the margin system. Collateral values collapsed. Brokers demanded cash. Retail investors were forced to liquidate into a falling market. Many lost everything in days. But for the well-capitalized, the sell-off offered what scarcity always offers: power at the bargaining table. With cash in hand and access to credit when others had none, the largest banks and industrial groups bought stakes in competitors, mills, mines, rail assets, and city blocks at cents on the dollar. A crash that annihilated household balance sheets became a shopping season for institutions that could wait while everyone else was forced to sell. The central bank's posture after the crash sharpened the divide. Rather than flooding the system to backstop solvent institutions and households, policy turned deflationary. Money growth stalled, then reversed. Bank failures mounted thousands between 1930 and early 1933, and each failure erased deposits, cutting spending, pushing prices lower, triggering new defaults, and causing still more failures. It was a self-feeding contraction. A handful of institutions, closely integrated with the Federal Reserve Network and with access to emergency facilities, survived and even expanded their reach as rivals disappeared. What the public experienced as a whirlwind looked, from the commanding heights, like a mechanism for pruning competitors. Contemporaries noticed the pattern. Business owners complained that credit windows slammed shut for them, even while marquee corporations refinanced on favorable terms. Henry Ford, never shy about blaming Wall Street, argued that small firms were starved of oxygen while the giants could breathe. You can debate his motives, but consolidation is plain in the statistics of the mid-1930s. Fewer banks, greater concentration, and a steeper hierarchy of financial power than before the break. Policy that was sold as neutral in effect reinforced the pecking order. Consider the micromechanics that made the 1920s boom so combustible. Call money markets let brokers borrow overnight and roll debt forward so long as prices rose. Investment trusts packaged pools of shares into vehicles that looked diversified, but were often leveraged pyramids balancing on the same collateral. Advertising promised that scientific investing had replaced risk. Radio makers financed radios so people could hear market news that encouraged them to buy more shares in the radio makers. As gains compounded, the loop tightened. Leverage inflated prices, rising prices justified more leverage, and the same collateral was pledged again and again. Timeline details matter too. In early 1928, the Fed began tightening, lifting the discount rate and jawboning banks to restrain margin loans. Headlines shrugged, prices climbed into late summer of 1929. But the foundation had shifted. Once credit growth slowed, the machinery that levitated stocks began to sputter. After the crash, policy choices compounded the contraction. Adherence to the international gold standard kept monetary conditions tight. Liquidationist voices argued that failure was a cleansing force, and the doctrine of sound money strangled recovery just when oxygen was most needed. The 1933 banking holiday and subsequent reorganization stabilized the system. After much of Main Street had already paid the price, bank failures were not just statistics, they were maps of power. When a rural bank closed, loans to farmers and shopkeepers vanished, and so did the local knowledge about who could survive with time and flexible terms. Larger city banks rarely reopened those lines. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, created in 1932 to supply emergency capital, was criticized for helping significant institutions first and at scale, while small borrowers queued for crumbs. Each rescue was explained as necessary to protect the system, and yet the system that emerged was one in which fewer, bigger players set the rules. Politics traced the fault lines. The Senate's 1932-1934 investigations, led by Ferdinand Pecora, exposed stock pools, insider allocations, and tax dodges practiced by leading houses. The hearings fed public anger, but also clarified where authority resided, with those who combined finance, information, and access to policy rooms. The Glass-Steagall Act and the creation of the FDIC in 1933 insulated depositors and separated investment from commercial banking. Those reforms mattered, yet they also stabilized the primacy of the institutions large enough to meet the new standards and navigate the new paperwork, while thousands of smaller outfits exited. Internationally, the contraction rewired dependency lines. After World War I, the United States had become the world's chief creditor, with dollar loans flowing to Europe and Latin America. The Depression interrupted those flows and called in debts. Germany, already struggling under reparations, saw production plunge and unemployment soar. Its banking system buckled, and emergency loans tightened foreign oversight of its finances. Britain left gold in 1931 and formed a sterling bloc. The United States devalued in 1933 to 1934, raising the dollar price of gold. Each move redistributed losses and gains, and the net result was to channel capital and authority through a handful of financial centers, especially New York and London, where the largest banks could arbitrate terms. At home, misery was not evenly shared. Tenant farmers lost land to foreclosure, shopkeepers failed, urban workers stood in breadlines. Meanwhile, sectors with access to strategic capital, oil, steel, utilities consolidated and emerged with enlarged market shares. Petroleum interests linked to the Rockefeller orbit expanded pipelines and refining capacity. The House of Morgan, though criticized in hearings, retained a coordinating role across investment syndicates. The New Deal, while providing genuine relief through work programs and social insurance, also routed billions in contracts to firms capable of winning bids, bonding projects, and delivering at national scale. Narratives about the New Deal deserve a double lens. Public works built roads, schools, and parks. Labor gained protections. Depositors slept easier. Yet the procurement process steered large, vertically integrated firms toward still greater scale. Defense mobilization in the late 1930s and early 1940s amplified that tilt. By the war's end, corporate giants in aircraft, chemicals, steel, and energy possessed unprecedented capacity, surrounded by regulatory frameworks that formalized their centrality. Crisis had organized the economy in a new pattern. Fewer nodes, thicker connections, and barriers to entry that favored incumbents. The psychological choreography is just as instructive. Booms produce hubris. Busts produce fear. In fear, citizens accept sweeping measures they would reject in calm. Financial elites understand this rhythm. Messaging frames interventions as technical necessities. Complexity obscures distributional choices. And once a policy architecture is installed under emergency banners, it tends to persist. What begins as temporary scaffolding hardens into the structure of the economy. None of this requires a cartoon of omniscient masterminds. It requires incentives, information, asymmetries, and control over choke points, credit, payments, media, and law. When those converge, crises can be guided, prolonged, or strategically resolved. That is the unsettling lesson of the Great Depression, seen from the vantage point of power rather than innocence. The suffering of the many can coincide with the consolidation of the few, and the machine can be tuned so that both outcomes occur at once. By 1945, the United States had not only emerged from the trough, it had installed itself at the center of global finance and industry. The dollar reigned, American banks underwrote reconstruction, and multinational corporations exported managerial techniques and capital goods across the world, institutions built in response to catastrophe. The SEC, the FDIC, the Bretton Woods bodies helped stabilize capitalism's surface while anchoring American primacy beneath it. The Depression was a tragedy. It was also a turning point engineered in such a way that those at the top suffered least and gained most. History books often close the chapter with moral lessons about greed and bubbles. Those lessons are not wrong. They are incomplete. The deeper lesson is about power over the cycle. Control over credit is the ability to manufacture scarcity or abundance, move prices, compel sales, and decide winners. Crashes then become more than storms. They are levers. Public opinion can be guided by the same institutions that intermediate money. Newspapers, newsletters, research circulars, and rating services. The boundary between neutral analysis and self-interested persuasion is porous when the analysts also sit on underwriting committees. There is also the question of how assets change hands in a downturn. Distressed owners do not merely sell, they sell under duress. A bank that can extend or deny a rollover loan can determine whether a factory is auctioned next week or recapitalized for 5 years. If the loan is denied, the foreclosure discount becomes the price. Cash-rich buyers arrive as saviors and leave as owners. In the early 1930s, such transfers happened at scale in real estate. Railroads, utilities, and manufacturing lines became routine. Diplomacy and monetary policy intertwined as well. The 1933 London Economic Conference attempted to coordinate currencies and arrest deflation, but competing interests scuttled agreement. The United States pursued domestic reflation, raised the official gold price, and then anchored a new parity under the Gold Reserve Act. Creditors and debtors on both sides of the Atlantic saw their positions reshuffled. At home, the Supreme Court's Gold Clause cases upheld the government's power to void contractual clauses, shifting losses from debtors to creditors and rewriting incentives for future contracts. Agriculture shows the same logic of power. The Agricultural Adjustment Act paid farmers to reduce acreage to lift prices, but small tenants and sharecroppers often absorbed the displacement while larger landholders collected checks. New lending agencies offered refinancing to those who could navigate paperwork and wait for approvals. The administrative burden itself functioned as a filter, favoring the already organized and well-advised. Labor policy moved in tandem. The Wagner Act recognized collective bargaining and helped boost wages in some sectors. Yet the bargaining table was frequently set inside firms whose scale had grown because they alone survived the credit drought. Industrial peace, higher productivity, and a stable flow of government contracts bound labor and big capital into a post-depression compact. Stability arrived, but it arrived on terms set by those who could survive the barren years without selling the family silver.